All right, everybody. Chapter 28 is going to be pretty straightforward because it's just World War I, and that's something that I think all of you know a great deal about anyway, and something we've certainly covered a lot in class. So we know that mania are the reasons. We've got the arms race, we've got imperialism, industrialization that we're going to be getting into shortly, that all of the nations involved have increased industrial capabilities. That means making stuff in factories. Nationalism. We also saw this was the rise of the U.S. and Japan, and then we saw a Bolshevik revolution in Russia, and that leads to the Russian Revolution. So, first, we don't really even need to cover this. This should be in your notes anyway. The coming of the Great War, that section in your textbook, which begins on page 658, as diplomatic tensions. There's colonial rivalries as Europe is rushing around trying to be imperialist, taking over places for their resources, and then the arms races. A big part of it, the origin, is the fear of Germany. Germany is a strong nation, as we talked about with the bar fight and with the war of attrition warm-up question you guys had. Germany was treated at the end of the war like the bully, but that's only because before the war they were very powerful. So the Triple Entente forms with Russia, England, and France, and the Germans realize that they need to kind of balance things out, so they create the Triple Alliance with Austria, Hungary, and Italy, and then they later just become known as Central Powers. And so they're trying to have global dominance in one way or another. So they try to position themselves for the colonies so that they can extract resources, which then will help their industrial production and wealth. But then in Europe, they're also building up weapons. That's the militarism that you guys saw in Mania. And pause whenever if you want to look at these and shorten this however you'd like. I'm not going to go through a whole lot of detail on this because we've already covered most of it in class. Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and that meant Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia declared war on Austria, Germany violated Belgian neutrality, Britain declared war on them, France declared war on Germany, Germany declared war on Russia, and that was that whole big tangled web. They thought it was going to be brief, as I already told you. They were, in fact, young men were afraid they were going to miss the war because they thought it was going to be so quick. The reason they thought it was going to be so quick was because so many weapons, so many new weapons, and they thought that it would just be over and done with. However, because of the new tactics that you guys were supposed to have looked for, namely trench warfare, it was a prolonged conflict that became what's known as a war of attrition. That's the unprecedented death. Just kill as many of you on each side as could be killed. So there were two fronts, and that's something that's important for you to know. There's the Western Front, which is Germany on the French side, and then the Eastern Front, which is Germany on the Russian side. So there's lots to go along with this, and if you're interested, look, there's a book called All Quiet on the Western Front. You might want to do a little bit of research on that just so you can see some of the conditions there. But basically it was this wholesale slaughter. So then Eastern Europe was in an interesting situation because, especially as we saw in the age of authoritarianism, they're not central, and they're sort of dependent. They're either dependent on Western Europe or on Russia or on the Middle East in one way or another. The Balkans in particular is what we're looking at here, and it was very devastating, as you can see. But the Italy was a part of the main major alliance, but they weren't as effective, and that's just part of the reason that they ended up flipping sides. And then with Russia, what we also see is that because they were economically weak, they were stagnant. They got rid of their czar, and that ended up getting them out of the war, and they made a peace with Germany. So the home fronts, what we see here is this is the beginning of the rise of authoritarianism. Why did these dictators have the ability to take power? Well, part of it is because during the war, the government takes a lot of power for itself in order to run the war effort. Propaganda we've seen, and then we see labor unrest, and what's important there is that leads to a major revolution in Russia. It starts off as a civil war, becomes then the Bolsheviks seize power in this Russian Revolution, and that starts the age of communism in the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And we've also seen that women replace men in the workplace and start calling for political and social equality, and women gain the right to vote in a lot of Western countries like Britain, Germany, and US. Now, outside of Europe, this is something that we talked about, like with Australia getting brought into the fight. The British dominions, remember there's the settler colonies, there's non-settler colonies, and the Dominion like India sends soldiers or sends aid. And Japan, in the bar fight example, was on the other side of the room yelling encouragement. They didn't actively get involved in the European war. They were just taking or attacking German territory in the Pacific, part of Germany's colony holdings. Now, the war shifted whenever the United States joined, and Germany tried to scramble back and have a last-ditch effort to win. The reason the United States got involved, remember I told you a couple of reasons. The Germans had something called unrestricted submarine warfare. Basically, they were sinking any ship that was in the water, figuring that it was going to be giving aid to Britain or France in one way or another. So they came up with the U-boat, the Unterseeboot, which is a submarine, and they would sink any ship. Well, one such ship that they sank was called the Lusitania, which was a passenger liner, like a cruise liner, like a Carnival Cruise or whatever. And on that ship, there were a little over 100 Americans. American people were kind of angry at that our citizens got killed by Germans and we weren't involved in the war. And so Germany apologized. They said they would stop. Then Germany sent a telegram to Mexico called the Zimmerman Telegraph, saying, hey, Mexico, if you will attack the United States from the south, keep them busy and out of the war, we'll wrap up things here in Europe, and then we'll come over there and help you fight the United States. And when we win over there, you'll get to have California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas as territory back. Well, that telegraph was intercepted by us, and we realized that the Germans were trying to get us into a war that the American people didn't want to get involved in. It wasn't our fight. It was something Europe had to worry about. So Germany made it our fight, and we finished it. And as a result, that big major essential question we saw last week, the physical, economic, social, psychological results of the war, included the Great Depression, totalitarianism, death of the optimism, that there was the excitement that was surrounding the honor of war before the war, but then after this it was just devastating and traumatic and terrible. So there's a lot of psychological as well as economic, social, and political consequences of World War I. Then the failed peace. This is the perfect name for the section. Failed peace because they blamed Germany and punished Germany, and really it was only because Germany was the one that caused a lot of death. It wasn't Germany's fault. They joined in with their ally. Remember, it started as a regional conflict, Serbia and Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary was imperialist, took over Serbia. Serbia had the ethnic nationalism that they wanted to be free of Austrian control. That exploded into an assassination. Then, hello, World War I. Also, as a result, was the Ottoman Empire was done. Now, remember, there's a whole lot of questions that we could ask up to this point. Like, why is there turmoil in the Middle East? Why can't Israelis and Palestinians get this sorted out? Why is Syria in conflict? Why is there problems in Iraq or Iran? Why? Well, this is why. World War I is pretty much why. Because when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, remember, there's a term that you guys should see in your textbook called mandate. Well, the mandates occurred because the British essentially chopped up what was left of the Ottoman Empire after the Ottomans were on the losing side. Then the nationalist assault. What this section is talking about in your textbook is Europe was not really able to focus on their colonies while they're busy focusing on killing one another. So while they were trying to either make sure they maintain power in the colonies or trying to get the colonies to contribute more to the war efforts, the British and the French were making all sorts of promises. Yes, you guys can vote. Yes, you can control your local affairs. Making promises that then, after the war, they said, oh, no, we didn't really, that's not what we meant. What we meant was during the war you can run things, but after the war we're back, now we're in charge again. And this is where we see India and Africa really beginning to play. Remember, we've had chapters on these where you guys saw the nationalist movements, you saw the independence movement, so you guys have seen this stuff before. Just reminding you, the Indian Nationalist Congress is something that comes out of this. They're challenging colonial authority. They're challenging the Europeans being in power in an imperialist way in their countries. The mass movement, what this talks about, we've seen before. The British they weren't exactly nice. They were brutal in some ways, and this is why people like Gandhi that we see down here preached nonviolence. Let the violent oppressors be seen as violent oppressors. If the Indians were to fight back, then they could be said that they were revolutionaries, rebels, causing problems, whatever. If the Indians, as Gandhi encouraged and promoted, took it and didn't fight back, then the whole wide world would see the British troops and the British crown being horribly oppressive and racist to the peaceful Indian nation. So that's what they did. There were a lot of people that were, like you see Tilak, there's a lot of people that were wanting to take up arms and fight violently against it. But the British were a very powerful nation, and so they were able to counteract it. Then Gandhi, this is why the violence didn't work. So Gandhi says, let's do this way. If we had guns, we could use guns. Actually, Gandhi had said at one point, but the British had the guns and they used them to great effect. So nonviolence ended up promoting Indian nationalism, and then eventually 1947 causing Indian independence. Then Egypt. Remember, we've seen all this stuff. Remember the name Nasser? Well, we've seen this before. This is where it all starts. Egypt, with Britain getting involved in the Middle East, Egypt, Ottoman Empire, and all that, it puts the population of Egypt and the British at odds. So this is nationalism we see here ends up going to down here, the revolt in Egypt, 1919. Nasser was the guy that led the coup in 1952. So it starts early on, like right at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Why is Nasser such an important name? Why was Egypt a focus in this nationalist independence movement? Well, because they start pushing back. So we see Turkey, the country Turkey, comes into existence as a result of the Ottoman Empire being broken up. And this is where we see the mandates that you guys have seen. This causes problems that even we can see today. So if you watch the news and you see Israel-Palestine, and that's happening a lot in the news, Palestinian stabbings, Jewish retaliation. Why is that happening today? Well, because it goes back 100 years to when the League of Nations approved the Jewish homeland in Palestine, and Britain broke it up into what's called the Mandate. That's still in play today. So the World War I, part of the reason it's such a huge turning point for the world and for the 20th century is because most of what we can see going on in the world, either out of Europe or in Africa or in the Middle East, goes straight back to the end of the war. Do look at the in-depth part about women in Asian and African nationalist movements, because you should be able to compare and contrast the status of women politically, economically, socially in different places of the world, different places at the same time. So we might say in Asia compared to Europe, or in Africa compared to in America. So read through that section in the book itself and get the detail. And then the beginnings of the liberation struggle in Africa. This is where we start to see the beginnings of the nationalist movement to get rid of European imperialism, which we're going to be seeing coming up pretty soon with the Conference of Berlin. Why is Africa pushing back against in this nationalist way? Well, their movement starts with this thing, Pan-Africanism. Make sure you look that up and you know what Pan-Africanism is. Pan-African unity. Pan means across. So make sure you know what Pan-Africanism is. That's very important from the College Board. That's specifically out of the key concepts. So basically at the end of this, as we wrap up chapter 28, and as a result we wrap up our study of the 1900 to the present time period, World War I set the stage. Everything that we've seen from chapter 36 all the way back now to chapter 28 has sort of led up to World War I. It was a major event, and this is why the periodization starts in the year 1900, because 1900 is when we see this new era, this new dawn, not just a new century, but almost a new civilization as a result of World War I. So I'm going to scroll through these. You can pause these key terms as you like. This is something new. I'll try differently. Just pause as needed. Pause as needed. Pause as needed. Especially with this guy, Tsar Nicholas II. He's important. I'll talk about him in the notes in class. Propaganda, Bolsheviks. Pause as needed. Pause as needed. Pause as needed. Some of these you don't really need to worry about. Names, big names that you've seen a lot, like Gandhi, Indian Congress Party, those kinds of names are important. Mandates, that's important. Ataturk is important. Zionist is important. Balfour is important. Pogrom, Herzl, Dreyfus Affair. Nasser, important. Pan-Africanism, there it is, again. Negritude, that's something that's important to look into. Look for the definition of it and what it means for this chapter. This is very, very important. Armenian genocide, League of Nations. And that's it.